Well, Steve and David, I've been enjoying watching the first part of World Wars, which you have coming up on the History Channel here on Memorial Day. It's a three-part documentary series. Tell us about just the idea of putting this together. And a lot of folks would not have had the idea of putting World War One with World War Two.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on this, first of all. So yeah, we started looking into the origin stories of the people we know. So trying to see these wars through these iconic figures. And the more we looked into it, the more we saw that the two wars were actually connected. Because most people, yeah, think of them as two different wars, but when you look at it as a whole, you realize that it really was one 30-year period of war, and that at the end of World War One, it was inevitable that there was going to be a World War Two.
The whole thing opens up on a very young Adolf Hitler and something that happens to him right away at the beginning, which I won't spoil for people, but well, I guess it's in the history books too. But why the focus on him right at the beginning there?
Well, I think, he, like it or not, he is the lead of this whole time period. He certainly drove the world into the Second World War. And I think he's the most known figure. So we wanted to start with something. And when you see it, there's a fact in there that I think is the sort of the most iconic thing about Hitler. So we thought it was sort of a cool way to start the whole thing, to find out that that's how that came about.
Isn't it amazing that a person like that, not only an evil person, but somebody from outside of Germany, I guess I knew that, but it really had never sunk in. Somebody could come into a country and take it, take it over like that.
Yeah, I think I think you see in this that he tried to do this at first and it didn't work. And then as we get into night two, you'll see that the conditions became right for him to be able to do it. The Great Depression had such a catalyst effect on Hitler's rise to power. The fact that the countries became isolationist. You actually see in night two that the Allied countries, after the Great Depression, focused on building infrastructure, roads, jobs, that kind of stuff, whereas the Axis powers focused on building militaries. And it was interesting to see, like, there was a period of about 10 years, maybe not even 10 years, probably a period of about 4 or 5 years where no one was watching what anybody else was doing.
You focus in that first part on a lot of the leaders people who would become leaders in World War II and the younger versions of them in World War One. What jumped out of you on those 7 or 8 people as a surprise?
I think you start to see that you as a person, you make your decisions off your past experiences. So I think the first one we saw was Churchill with Gallipoli, because at a young age, Churchill was in this very important position of power. He's Lord of the Admiralty, and so he ordered Gallipoli, which is a huge disaster. And then you see 20 years later, he's part of D-Day, which is basically the same thing as Gallipoli, but he does it differently that time from what he's learned. And Churchill was an interesting story because he, well, I don't know how much I want to ruin it for everyone, but basically he was fired, demoted, and it took him 20 years to get back into the same position of power that he had before.
These days, the last, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years, that would be much more difficult to do because you're on television all the time. You're doing speeches all the time. Every mistake you make is magnified. So back then, though, his mistakes, I guess, at least from our large part, would have been forgotten, so he was able to climb back up.
Yeah, I think that's true. And but he did also, when he was fired, he instead of just I don't know, he was offered a desk job. Instead of just licking his wounds, he put himself on the front lines. So demoted himself to the point where he's on the front lines fighting in a war, and he built himself back up. It's a sort of incredible redemption story.
A lot of documentaries are just strictly your narration with your photos and video if you have it. But you like to do the, I guess there would be more a docudrama miniseries because you hire actors that play out these parts as the story's being told. What made you want to go with that approach for your projects?
I think that we were just trying something new. I mean, there are people that do the archive approach extremely well. Obviously, there are a lot of people that do that well. So our goal was to tell these through character, because I feel like when a lot of facts are thrown at you, you start to get lost in the facts. But if you tell it through character, it becomes like a scripted show where you invest in the characters. And then when the facts come at you, they deal with the character stakes. And so you're invested in the fact all of a sudden because it has an effect on what the character is doing and decides to do.
You've got a really good eye for casting. I noticed that even last year with the Men Who Built America as well. Are you looking for really talented actors, or the people that look the most like the person, or a combination of both?
I mean, it's good if it's both, but then we had a really hard time finding Hitler. I remember right when we started casting, there were all these announcements. Somebody saw our casting notice, and we'd see all over the web, like, finally, it's good to look like Hitler, So, but in this case, we were looking for people that look like them and were believable, and we got lucky with the two people that played Hitler, because it's very hard not to make that character into a cartoon. Because he can, I don't know, I remember there was an ad I saw while we were casting. It was like some ad for, I don't know if it was Crate and Barrel, but it was a teapot that looked like Hitler. So, people know Hitler so well, and the mustache. We had to find people that could embody him, because we did want to humanize him. I mean, part of this was, I felt if we could humanize these characters, you're into them. But even with Hitler, I felt like if we did humanize him, it almost let him off the hook more easily. Because to say like, oh, he was a monster, makes you feel like, oh, he couldn't help himself. And I think when you watch this, you realize this guy knew exactly what he was doing. He was very calculated in doing it, and he almost pulls it off.
But I did not know this younger version, especially that you see most of the way through the first part. Just such a put-upon person. Just if he had any kind of breaks in life, maybe he doesn't go this direction.
Exactly. He was awkward. There's a lot of stories we weren't able to tell for time, but there's like all this interesting stuff of him adopting a dog in the trenches because the dog was his friend, and then I think they killed his dog or something. I mean, it was an outcast within his own troops. So he was really looking for a place to belong. He found it, and then he found that when Germany surrendered, that was like an affront to him, where suddenly he didn't have a place to belong. And when he joined the Nazi Party, which was like the National Socialist Workers' Party, he was actually sent there as a spy, and then felt so comfortable there that became part of it, and then became the leader of it.
Tell me about the relationship, going to the American side here, of Douglas MacArthur and George Patton.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, and you see that in the first episode about how there's a true story where Patton is on the battlefield with tanks, and he sees one other guy on the battlefield not flinching. So he walked up to him. They didn't know each other. He walked up to this guy, and it was a young MacArthur. And that's where they met for the first time. So, and then they fought together, and then, they become basically leaders of, a general. One becomes a general in Europe, and one becomes general in the Pacific, and um, it's just amazing that it's amazing to see what they were like young because of what they became.
Did they like each other or just respect each other?
They definitely respected each other. I don't know, I mean, Patton's such a
Different kinds of personalities.
yeah. I mean, it was interesting that when we were looking at MacArthur, he saw before we dropped the atom bomb, he saw invading Japan as his big moment in life. He was basically disappointed because he saw that invasion as his way to become president.
Mm.
So, even though um, a million lives were projected to be lost if we invaded Japan, in fact, there's a fact that they made so many Purple Hearts during that time that we still use them today when we give out Purple Hearts.
Wow. Um, you have a lot of great commentators throughout. Senator McCain, Colin Powell, John Major, and others. What is that process hard to get those kind of people lined up, or how? Tell us about doing that.
Yeah, that was difficult, and luckily they did it. And what's most interesting about these people is that, and a lot of times, even in our own documentaries, it's sort of general what they say, like, "Oh, America's great" or whatever. Um, in this one, these people knew this history well. There are people who have studied it, I guess, so history won't repeat itself, even though it does. But they knew it. They knew the lessons. They've made it part of their careers to study this. So when they were telling the stories, they go seamlessly into what we were trying to show, which was really nice because they were supporting what the picture was. And then, of course, when they say it, they add a feeling or a perspective to it, which I found so interesting.
On World War One, obviously there's nobody that you can just speak with, but World War Two, did you find yourself wanting to reach out and interview some of the veterans, some of the people that were around to get a clearer perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could have done 20 hours on this. I felt like there was so much history we had to leave out. It was a big challenge to try and figure out how to tell this whole time period in 6 hours. So, yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by anybody that I've always been fascinated by war. One of my favorite books was Red Badge of Courage growing up. I've always been fascinated, like, what would it like to be in battle? I think I'd probably be terrible. But, it's amazing when, I mean, and people are doing it now. It's like, you ask somebody to, die for their country. Just imagine. It's hard to imagine. So yeah, I would, anytime you get to talk to people like that, it's pretty amazing.
Whether it's fictional stories or real life stories, when they're made into movies about anything related to war, there's so many levels of drama. Drama meaning fiction or nonfiction that you can't hardly go wrong if you're a good storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, and I think people gravitate towards World War II because it seems like the perfect war. It seems like it's good versus evil. It's always more complex than that, but probably as close as you're ever going to see.
If a studio gave you a big budget of money, is there a particular story or a particular person that you focus on here you would love to make a movie about?
Yeah, I mean, wasn't that
we popped off there for just a few seconds, but it wasn't long.
Sorry about that.
Well, that's okay. I was asking you about like a feature film, like a scripted feature film that maybe on a story out of World War I or World War II, or even a person.
Yeah, I mean, Patton was an awesome movie. I wish I had made that. But I mean, Patton is fascinating. You know, Band of Brothers is one of my favorite miniseries of all time, and I feel like, you know, there's such limited time in this. I mean, I knew very little about Tojo. I think he's fascinating. That whole Pacific Theater, what happened there. There's just like a million stories within this. I mean, I think it's fascinating just what Patton did when he found the concentration camps is fascinating.
Last year, I enjoyed Men Who Built America, which was also about several business leaders in this country. One thing I think that they have in common with the new project World Wars is a rise to power. And in a lot of cases on the one before, which were business leaders, the power in almost every case, it seemed like it corrupted them. They started out, I think all but one that you focused on were from modest backgrounds or even poor backgrounds, and then over time that power and that money seemed to turn them into totally different people.
Yeah, I think power corrupts. That's what they say, and I think when you watch the story of Hitler, as you watch through these 3 nights, you see that he actually learned all these lessons from World War I. And the power corrupted him so much that he went against what he knew not to do. And his ego is his downfall. I mean, obviously he's an evil person, but that doesn't mean he wouldn't have gotten away with it. Because, the history is basically written by the winners. And so it's that story that you see very often, which is the rise and fall of somebody. And why that fall happens is usually because of power, ego, all of those things that happen when you become that powerful. On the other hand, with some of these people, you see that they were powerful and then humbled and then came back much better. I would say that would be the case with Roosevelt, Churchill, where they sort of redeemed themselves. So it's interesting, I think, to see the arcs of people.
Do you think those that you just mentioned, the failure earlier on humbled them enough that when they did become even more powerful, that's why they didn't have, the fall or the corruption that other people have?
I think so. I mean, I think it also depends on the person. I don't think I realized until we did this how similar Hitler and Stalin were to each other. And Stalin certainly had a lot of falls in the beginning, but the lesson he took from that was to become a dictator. So yeah, it's interesting how people react to things in their time period. I find like when you watch a scripted show, you watch Breaking Bad, you see the arc of that character. I find that I like that you could find these real arcs with real people because people are complex. And so yeah, I've always found it so interesting what people really did in the situations they were in.
Well, it's an excellent program. I can't wait to watch the other 2 parts. And when you do something like World Wars, it feels like to me, just as a viewer, that tons of people worked on this. How many people worked on World Wars, roughly?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have like a very big budget, so it was like very guerrilla filmmaking. But there were a lot of people that worked on it hard, so it was like a lot of dedicated people working on it, but not a huge crew because we just didn't have that kind of budget.
Tell me, last year we're an awards website, so I would definitely want to make sure I ask you about the Emmy Awards. You were up for writing, and you were up for the program itself, producing Men Who Built America. What was that experience like being nominated for the Emmys?
that was really awesome because I'm basically just happy that I actually get to make a show like this. So something like the fact that I got to go to the Emmys was awesome. I mean, it was that's like lightning striking like 30 times in the same place. I feel like it was just like incredible to get to go.
Well, expect more of it this summer. I think you're going to have several more and maybe some wins this time around. What's down the road for you? What other projects can we expect after this one airs?
I'm doing the history of the West. So seeing how modern America was built through the West, which is really interesting. It's a different thesis than I sort of have ever thought before that we found. And I'm executive producing that with Robert Redford, which is really cool. And I'm also doing something called Sons of Liberty, which is a scripted miniseries that I'm doing for History Channel that's about the Revolutionary War. It's the 10 years leading up to the Revolutionary War. So
I love stuff like that. Any kind of history stuff I love. I loved years ago John Adams on HBO, speaking of Revolutionary War and the Old West kind of stuff. Even documentaries like Lewis and Clark that Ken Burns did. I love those kinds of things.
Yeah, me too. I love them too. I can't get enough of them.
Well, I think we can sense your love for all of these different projects and just watching them. And thanks for joining us today. Good luck at the Emmys this summer, and good luck with the ratings. I think it's going to be another blockbuster.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me on.